In the ancient land of Canaan stood a city that no army could conquer. Its name was Jericho. The city was surrounded by enormous walls, massive stone barriers so thick that houses were built inside them. Soldiers stood on top of the walls day and night, watching for enemies. For generations, Jericho had been considered impossible to defeat. No army had ever broken through. No king had ever conquered it. But one day, a new people arrived at the edge of the land. They were the Israelites, a nation that had wandered the wilderness for 40 years after escaping slavery in Egypt. And now their leader, Joshua, stood before the mighty walls of Jericho. He looked up at the towering stone fortress. Thousands of soldiers guarded the city. Gates of thick wood and iron were sealed shut. From a human perspective, the battle was already lost. Joshua's army was smaller. They had no massive siege weapons, no giant towers to climb the walls, no strategy strong enough to break a city like this. But then something unexpected happened. God gave Joshua a battle plan. Not a plan of weapons, not a plan of war. Instead, it sounded almost impossible. For 6 days, the entire army of Israel was to march around the city once each day. No attacks, no arrows, no fighting, just walking. 7 priests would carry sacred trumpets, and the Ark of the Covenant would be carried behind them. Then on the 7th day, everything would change. The army would march around the city 7 times. The trumpets would sound. The people would shout. And God made a promise that sounded unbelievable. The walls of Jericho would collapse, without a single sword striking them. The soldiers of Jericho watched from the walls as the strange army began to march. Once around the city, silently. Then they left. The next day, they came back again. And no one inside Jericho understood what was about to happen. Because in just a few days, the most powerful walls in the land would fall. Classical building fire. The city of Jericho stood silent behind its enormous walls. From the towers above the gates, soldiers watched the land carefully. They had already heard about the Israelites who had crossed the Jordan River. They had heard the rumors. Stories about a people whose God had split the sea. Stories about an army protected by divine power. But Jericho's walls had stood for generations. They believed no one could break them. Outside the city, the army of Israel had gathered. Thousands of men stood ready for battle, waiting for the command of their leader, Joshua. Yet the order Joshua gave them sounded nothing like a battle strategy. Today, he told them, we march. No attack, no weapons raised, no arrows fired. Instead, the army formed a long procession. At the front walked 7 priests carrying sacred trumpets made from ram's horns. Behind them came the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant, the sacred chest that represented the presence of God among the people. Behind the ark marched the soldiers of Israel, thousands of men, all silent. The gates of Jericho were tightly shut as the people inside watched nervously from the walls. Then something strange happened. The Israelites began walking. Slowly, quietly, they marched once around the entire city. The soldiers on the walls stared in confusion. Where was the attack? Where were the ladders? Where were the siege towers? But the Israelites did nothing. No one shouted. No one fired an arrow. Only the sound of the priests' trumpets echoed through the air. After completing one full circle around the city, the army simply turned around and walked away. They returned to their camp. Inside Jericho, the people were puzzled. What kind of army marches around a city and then leaves? The next day, the same thing happened again. The Israelites returned. The priests blew their trumpets. The army marched silently around Jericho once more. Then they left again. Day 3. The same march. Day 4. Again. Day 5. Still the same strange ritual. The soldiers guarding Jericho began to laugh. From the safety of their massive stone walls, they mocked the army below. This is their plan, some of them shouted. They think walking will destroy our walls. But Joshua had given the people strict instructions. No one is to shout, he said. No one is to speak a word until the day I tell you. So the Israelites continued their silent march. One circle around the city. Then they returned to camp. Day after day, 6 days passed like this. Inside Jericho, the people began to relax. Whatever strange ritual the Israelites were performing, it didn't seem dangerous. The walls still stood. The gates were still closed. Nothing had changed. But the 7th day was coming, and the plan God had given Joshua was about to reach its final moment. Before sunrise on the 7th day, Joshua gathered the army again. But this time, the instructions were different. Today they would not march around the city once. They would march around it 7 times. And when the priests gave the signal, the entire army of Israel would shout. What happened next would become one of the most famous miracles in the Bible. Because those massive walls, the walls no army had ever broken, were about to face something far more powerful than weapons. They were about to face the power of God. The 7th day began before sunrise. While the sky was still dark and the land was quiet, Joshua gathered the army of Israel. Today would not be like the other days. For 6 days, they had marched around the great city of Jericho only once. But today, everything would change. Joshua stood before the soldiers and spoke clearly. Today we marched 7 times around the city. The people listened carefully. They had followed this strange command for 6 days without questioning it. Now the final moment had arrived. The priests took their places at the front of the procession. 7 priests held the ram's horn trumpets. Behind them came the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant, the sacred symbol of God's presence among Israel. Behind the Ark marched the army, thousands of soldiers, still silent. The gates of Jericho remained tightly shut. Inside the city, the people had already noticed something unusual. The Israelites were coming again, but this time much earlier than before. From the walls, soldiers watched the approaching army. Once again, the priests blew their trumpets. The sound echoed across the valley. Then the Israelites began their march. 1 circle around the city. The people inside Jericho watched with curiosity. When the first circle was complete, the soldiers expected the Israelites to leave again, just as they had done every day before. But they did not leave. Instead, they continued walking. They began a 2nd circle around the city. Now the watchers on the walls grew confused. Why were they still marching? Soon the Israelites completed the 2nd circle. Then the 3rd, the 4th. The priests' trumpets continued to sound as the army moved around the city again and again. Inside Jericho, tension began to rise. The soldiers were no longer laughing. Something about this moment felt different. The Israelites were not stopping. They were still marching. 5th circle, 6th circle. The sun climbed higher in the sky as the strange procession continued. Then the army began the 7th and final march around Jericho. Now the entire city seemed to hold its breath. When the 7th circle was complete, the priests suddenly stopped. The trumpets grew louder. Joshua raised his hand. For 6 days the people had remained completely silent. Now Joshua shouted a command that echoed across the battlefield. Shout, for the Lord has given you the city. In that moment, thousands of voices rose together. The entire army of Israel shouted with all their strength. The priests blew their trumpets as loudly as possible. And then something impossible happened. The ground began to tremble. The massive walls of Jericho shook. Cracks spread across the ancient stone. The mighty walls that had stood for generations suddenly began to collapse. Stone after stone crashed to the ground. The great fortress of Jericho was falling. The shout of the Israelites echoed across the valley. Thousands of voices rose together. The priests continued blowing their ram's horn trumpets, and the sound carried across the land surrounding Jericho. Then the impossible happened. The ground beneath the city began to tremble. At first, it was only a slight vibration, but within seconds, the shaking grew stronger. Cracks began to appear across the massive stone walls that had protected Jericho for generations. The soldiers standing on the walls felt the ground moving beneath their feet. They looked around in shock. This was not an attack. No battering rams struck the gates. No siege towers climbed the walls. Yet the mighty fortress was shaking. Then the first section of the wall collapsed. Huge stones broke loose and crashed to the ground with a thunderous roar. Dust exploded into the air. The people inside the city screamed in terror. More cracks spread across the walls. One section after another began to crumble. The mighty defense that had once seemed impossible to break was now collapsing before their eyes. Massive towers fell. Stone blocks shattered. The ground was covered in clouds of dust as the walls of Jericho came crashing down. Within moments, the once powerful city stood exposed. Where there had been towering walls, there were now open paths straight into the city. Outside the ruins, Joshua saw exactly what God had promised. The walls had fallen. Now the army of Israel surged forward. The soldiers ran straight ahead, climbing over the fallen stones and entering the city from every direction. For the first time in its history, Jericho was defenseless. The gates that once protected it no longer mattered. The walls that once made it invincible were gone. But before the battle fully began, Joshua gave one important command to his men. There was one family inside Jericho that must be saved. A woman who had helped the Israelite spies before the battle. Her name was Rahab. Joshua turned to the two men who had once entered the city as spies. "Go into the house of Rahab," he said. "Bring her out, along with her family, just as you promised." While the battle spread through the city, the two spies ran toward the part of the wall where Rahab's house had stood. Miraculously, one section of the wall had not collapsed. And inside that house, Rahab and her family were waiting. Because days earlier, she had hung a scarlet cord from her window. A signal, a promise that when Jericho fell, her life would be spared. Now the moment of that promise had arrived. And while the great city of Jericho was falling, one house still stood. While the city of Jericho was falling into chaos, two men moved quickly through the broken streets. They were the same spies who had secretly entered the city days before. And they had one mission: find Rahab. Long before the walls collapsed, Rahab had done something incredibly brave. When the Israelite spies first came into Jericho, the king had ordered his soldiers to capture them. But Rahab hid the spies on the roof of her house. She protected them, even though doing so could have cost her life. That night, Rahab made a request. She asked the spies to promise something. "When your people come to conquer this city," she said, "please spare my family." The spies agreed, but they gave her one instruction. She was to hang a scarlet cord from her window. Anyone inside the house marked by that red cord would be saved when the city fell. Now that moment had come. Through the dust and smoke of the collapsing city, the two spies finally reached Rahab's house. Miraculously, that section of the wall had not fallen, and hanging from the window was the same scarlet cord, the sign of the promise. The spies rushed inside. Rahab was there. So were her father, mother, brothers, and sisters. Her entire family had gathered in that house, just as she had told them to. "Come with us," the spies said quickly. "The city is falling." They led Rahab and her family safely out of Jericho and brought them to the camp of Israel. Outside the destroyed city, Rahab and her family were protected. Their lives were spared because of the promise that had been made. Meanwhile, inside Jericho, the battle came to an end. The great city that once stood behind towering walls had now fallen. But Joshua gave one final command to the people of Israel. The city of Jericho was not to be rebuilt. It was to remain a reminder of what had happened there. A reminder that victory did not come from weapons or human strength. It came from obedience to God, and from the faith to follow His instructions, even when they seemed impossible. As the dust slowly settled over the ruins of Jericho, the people of Israel realized something powerful. They had just witnessed a miracle. The walls that no army could break had fallen, not by swords, not by siege engines, but by the power of God alone. The once mighty city of Jericho now lay in ruins. Where towering walls had once stood, there were only piles of broken stone and dust. The streets that had been filled with soldiers and merchants were silent. The fortress that had seemed impossible to conquer was gone. The army of Israel gathered among the fallen walls as the smoke slowly rose into the sky. They had witnessed something extraordinary, a victory that had not come from swords or military power, but from obedience, from faith, from following the strange command God had given to Joshua. Joshua now stood before the people and gave them an important instruction. The city of Jericho was not to become another city of Israel. It was not to be rebuilt. Instead, it would remain a symbol, a reminder of what God had done. Joshua spoke a solemn warning before all the people. "Cursed is the one who attempts to rebuild this city, Jericho." He declared that anyone who tried to restore the city would face terrible loss. It was a powerful message. Jericho had fallen not because Israel was stronger, but because God had acted, and the ruins would stand as proof of that miracle. Meanwhile, the people of Israel carefully collected the valuable treasures from the city: gold, silver, bronze, iron. But these were not taken for personal gain. Joshua commanded that these treasures be placed in the treasury dedicated to the Lord. Everything about Jericho was to honor what God had done. Soon word of the miracle began to spread across the entire region. Stories traveled from town to town. People whispered about the army that marched silently around a city for 7 days, about the priests blowing trumpets, about the shout that shook the ground. about the walls that suddenly collapsed without a single weapon striking them. The name of Joshua became known throughout the land. But the people also understood something deeper. This victory had not come from Joshua alone. It had come from the power of God. And the fall of Jericho would become one of the most unforgettable stories in history. A reminder that sometimes the greatest victories come in the most unexpected ways. As the dust slowly settled over the ruins of Jericho, the people of Israel stood quietly among the fallen stones. Only days earlier, those walls had seemed impossible to defeat. They were thick, massive, unbreakable. Every soldier in Jericho believed their city was safe behind those towering defenses. But now the mighty fortress had fallen. Not by ladders, not by weapons, not by the strength of an army. The walls of Jericho had fallen because the people of Israel obeyed the command of God. When Joshua first received the strange instruction to march around the city, it must have sounded unusual to many of the soldiers. Walking around a city did not look like a battle plan. Blowing trumpets did not seem like a weapon, and shouting at walls certainly did not seem powerful enough to destroy them. Yet the people followed the command exactly as they were told. Day after day, they marched. They trusted. They obeyed. And on the seventh day, the miracle happened. The walls fell. The victory of Jericho became one of the most powerful stories in the Bible, because it reminds us of something important. Sometimes the greatest victories do not come from human strength. They come from faith. Faith to believe even when the plan seems impossible. Faith to obey even when the instructions seem strange. Faith to trust that God is working, even when we cannot yet see the result. The ruins of Jericho would remain as a reminder for generations. A reminder that no wall is too strong, no obstacle too great, and no challenge too impossible when God is involved. And so the story of Joshua and the fall of Jericho continues to be told even today. Because sometimes the greatest walls in life do not fall with force. They fall with faith.